Good afternoon, and welcome to the 2020 Dr. Morton Goldberg Lecture. Lourdes University has the honor of hosting the lecture several times since its inception in 1990, and as a university, we're honored to be a host institution. This year, working with fellow Lecture Fund committee members, we have brought two highly respected professors and accomplished professionals to address the dual identity of Muslims and Jews in America. Professor Howard Lupovitch and Saeed conduct the annual Building a Shared Future lecture series that focuses on fostering increased collaboration and connectivity between the Jewish and Muslims community. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the excellent work of Kate Butel, our Dean of Arts and Sciences at Lourdes, and the folks who helped us in our marketing were Colleen Sheets and her community. Dr. Butel has worked with our distinguished lecturers to bring forth a great presentation today that hopefully will challenge and encourage each of us to engage in dialogue that will better serve our greater community. At this time, Patrick Johnston, Senior Program Officer of Greater Toledo Community Foundations, will provide some opening remarks about the Foundation's connection to the lecture series. Thank you.
So I told Dr. Gawalik maybe we should come out and do this together and just pass it back and forth, but we weren't quite prepared for that as the presenters are. As Dr. Gawalik mentioned, my name is Patrick Johnston, and I serve as a Senior Program Officer at Greater Toledo Community Foundation. For those of you not familiar with our work, the Foundation was started 45 years ago to serve as a mechanism for ongoing charitable giving focused on Northwest Ohio and Southeast Michigan. Today, more than 900 separate funds make up the Greater Toledo Community Foundation. And last year, the Foundation processed more than $17 million in grants to local nonprofits from these funds, and that's the most in our history. Each of those 900 funds carries its own story and legacy forward through this local grant making. Dr. Morton Goldberg Lecture Fund was established at the Foundation 25 years ago. And if you look at the last page of your program, you'll see the amazing list of presenters who've been supported through this fund. Additionally, if you read the biographical sketch of Rabbi Goldberg's life, you can connect how the fund continues to support his priorities of promoting better understanding and positive relations among individuals from diverse racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds. This year's lecture will continue that tradition, and Greater Toledo Community Foundation is proud of the part we are able to play in continuing that legacy. Thank you, and enjoy the presentation. I'm going to now hand the microphone off to Dr. David Weinberg, who's going to introduce today's speakers. Thanks.
I was told that I don't have to yell. I want to first apologize for not standing up and, well, I don't know if I need to be recognized or not, but I had a physical injury a couple of weeks ago, and I'm still recovering a bit. But I did want to make this presentation. I know both speakers fairly well, and I know how excellent their presentations are going to be. Let me just make a couple of introductory remarks, if I might, before we begin. On behalf of the Greater Toledo Community Foundation and Lourdes University, I am pleased to introduce the 2020 Morton Goldberg Lecture. And I might say that a bit of self-pride, way back when I was one presenter, and it was one of the most exciting experiences in my life, certainly starting out as a young scholar. This afternoon's lecture is entitled Halacha, Sharia law on the dual identity of Muslims and Jews in America, and will be delivered by Wayne State's own Howard Lupovitch and Saeed Khan. Excuse me here. Just have to. I've got here. Dr. Lupovitch and Dr. Khan will speak on Halacha and Sharia law as a window into the ways that Muslims and Jews live with one foot in their own communities and one foot in the mainstream American society. And I envy them for being able to have one foot anywhere these days. But anyway, yes, lonely. Professor Lupovitch is a member of the History Department and the director of the Cohn-Haddow Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State. Professor Khan is a senior lecturer in Near East and Asian Studies and Global Studies at the university, as well as a research fellow at the Center for the Study of Citizenship. Together, they conduct the annual Building a Shared Future lecture series, which fosters increased collaboration and connectivity between the Jewish and Muslim communities. The annual lecture, as was noted a moment ago, honors the legacy of Dr. Morton Goldberg, who served as the rabbi of Congregation B'nai Israel here in Toledo beginning in 1937. He is credited with connecting the many communities in Toledo for more than 60 years, and his namesake lecture series promotes positive relations among individuals from diverse racial, ethnic, and religious backgrounds with an emphasis on Judaic studies. I might note in passing also that he was a wonderful neighbor, and we shared many, many interesting discussions over the back fence, so to speak. My understanding is that the procedure will be as follows. Each of the speakers will have approximately 30 minutes to give their presentations, and that will be followed by a Q&A. So without further ado, I present Professor Howard Lupovitch.
Good afternoon. Shalom Aleichem, Assalam Alaikum. Is this working? Everyone can hear me? Good. Thank you, David, for that very nice introduction. David didn't mention, he was my predecessor at Wayne in the history department and as the director of the Cohn-Haddow Center. So, thank you for warming it up for me. It was, or I should say, I guess I'm keeping it going after the excellent job you did there for years. So thank you. Thank you to the Goldberg family for sponsoring this lecture and for inviting us. I think I just met the Goldbergs before. It took us about 60 seconds to figure out how, that we're only about 2 degrees of maybe 1 degree of separation. Toledo, Detroit, not very far apart. We found someone in common. I think 60 seconds is about what it took. So it's very nice to be here, and thank you to Lourdes University for sponsoring the event. And this is a lovely auditorium and a nice place to speak. So what I'd like to talk about in the next 25 or 30 minutes or so is how American Jews have adapted halacha, a term I will define in a moment, to the complexities and the challenges and the opportunities of being Jewish in America. And then Saeed will do something similar with respect to Islam and Sharia law. I think the place to start, well, really the place to start is to note that I can't not note the fact that we're in Toledo, the border city between Michigan and Ohio, at a moment when the University of Michigan and Ohio State are engaged in a basketball game as we speak. So, apropos. So, which means if you, for whatever reason, if you need to take a peek at your phone to check what the score is, I understand. I will do my best not to do that. So, but seriously, the best place to start, or the necessary place to start, I would say, is to define what the term halacha means. It's an interesting term. Colloquially, or it's often used as the term to connote Jewish law, but the literal meaning of halacha is not law. There are other Hebrew words for law. There's din, there is chok, there is mishpat. The literal translation of halacha, which comes from a Hebrew word lalechet, which means to go or to proceed. So it doesn't literally mean law. The reason it's come to refer to Jewish law is it gives the sense that Jewish law is something which is dynamic, something which is evolutionary. Really, it might be more aptly translated or at least used to connote way of life as much as it connotes Jewish law. But it's come to mean Jewish law. Now, let me briefly recap what halacha was until the last century or two. Let's say prior to the emergence of the modern world, what halacha was. As a system of law for Jews, halacha for a millennium and a half had certain characteristics. The first was, as I said, it was something dynamic, not static. Halacha does not connote a legal code, even though there are important halachic publications which are legal codes. Rather, halacha is something which has adapted itself to circumstances, or more precisely, which has been adapted by scholars of halacha to particular circumstances. The metaphor for the dynamic nature of halacha, the one that intrigues me the most, is the metaphor of the chessboard, or the analogy of the chessboard. Now, I'd love to be able to take credit for this, but in the spirit of full disclosure, this is Rabbi Joel Roth's metaphor of the chessboard, and he said that halacha, it changes, it can be adapted, it is interpreted according to certain legal principles in the same way that the pieces on a chessboard can move around according to certain rules of the game. You know, rooks only straight, bishops only diagonal. And so at any point in a game of chess, the constellation of pieces on the board can look very different. Similarly, what halacha is, what the corpus of Jewish law, the specifics, the general, have changed at any given point in time. It can look different. It can change. That's one aspect. Secondly, what halacha managed to do for centuries is to strike a healthy balance between uniformity and diversity in Jewish life and Jewish religious practice. Let me give you a quick example of each. Uniformity meaning that for the last, I would say, at least millennium, maybe millennium and a half, it was possible for a Jew from any part of the world to walk into a house of prayer, synagogue, shul, whatever, anywhere else in the world, and more or less be able to follow the service, to be able to maybe participate in the service, maybe even lead the service, but above all, to be able to walk out of that service with a sense that they had fulfilled the obligation of prayer and had prayed in a meaningful way. That's uniformity. That's uniformity. Or to put it even more succinctly, yesterday in synagogues around the world, Jews read exactly the same thing from the Torah. Now, maybe some read a little less, and some read a little more, maybe some read some in translation, but it was the same passage from the Torah. Or one other example, if a Jew happens to be traveling over Passover, wherever you are, when it's the first night of Passover, you can find Jews having a Passover Seder. And most of the elements of the Seder itself are uniform. But beyond that sense of uniformity, within halacha as a system, there's also diversity. The example I think which really rings out to me is for about the last 700 years, there have been some Jews who will not eat legumes, or in Hebrew, kitniot, on Passover, because they think it violates, in their mind, it violates the restrictions, the dietary restrictions of kosher for Passover. But there also have been Jews who will eat these legumes on Passover, and that difference, which if you think about it, for 7 to 8 days a year, that's an important difference, has basically happened without incident for 700 years. That's an example of diversity. There were no Jews who said, oh, you eat kitniot, you're less of a Jew. There were no Jews who said, oh, you don't, you're less of... No problem there. I mean, contrast that to some of the nitpicky aspects of dietary laws that Jews will quibble about now. It's mind-blowing for reasons I'll mention in a second. So halacha was something that was dynamic. Halacha balanced between uniformity and diversity. Now, halacha as as a guide in Jewish life, had another important characteristic as well. That being that Jews who consider themselves to be observant regarded halacha as something binding and mandatory. That was the definition of an observant Jew for centuries. And you could be more observant or you could be less observant, but if you were observant, you accepted the basic principle that you're supposed to be doing this, even if you're not. And if you weren't, okay, so you're not. You're violating something, but it was regarded as mandatory. Now, these characteristics of a halacha were challenged in the last 2 centuries when we enter the modern world. One of the things the modern world introduced, and by modernity I mean more specifically citizenship for Jews, introduced a new role of religion in life, not only for Jews but generally. This new role of religion we use the term separation of religion and state to define it, or church and state to define it. And what it came down to was this: in the pre-modern world, halacha, observance of Jewish laws, as well as affiliating with the Jewish community, was not a choice for Jews. It was required. It was mandatory. And oftentimes the Jewish community had the authority to not only shame Jews who would violate halachic principles or not observe this or that, but actually be able to fine them money. In some cases, even incarcerate them. This today, in the world of separation of religion and state, would be a problem. If a Jewish community said, if a Jewish leader said, you didn't keep kosher, you have to pay $100 to the Jewish community, we might have a little First Amendment problem with that little situation. That would be a problem, but for a long time it wasn't. Now, that system of halacha being something required, it worked because Jews themselves, for the most part, preferred to live under a system of Jewish laws than any other system of law. So even though throughout the history of the diaspora, Jews have been law-abiding citizens, not by choice, but because Jewish tradition itself requires Jews to be law-abiding citizens, well, there was a kind of division of labor between halacha and between other laws of the land. This notion of being a law-abiding citizen goes all the way back to the prophet Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 29, this is Jeremiah's open letter to the Jews of the diaspora. This is to the first generation of Jews living in the diaspora outside the land of Israel. And among other things, he says to them is, Dirshu et shlom ha'ir asher higleti etchem shama, seek the welfare of the city into which I have exiled you. Hitpa'alu ba'ada el Adonai, pray on its behalf to God. And here's the key phrase, Ki bishloma yihiyeh lechem shalom. For in the peace of the city, you will find peace. In the welfare of the city, you will find peace. This is the prophet Jeremiah's instruction that Jews, wherever they live in the diaspora, must be loyal, law-abiding citizens. And this principle was codified centuries later in the Talmud with the very terse, succinct maxim, Dina di Malchuta Dina. The law of the land is the law. So Jews would observe Jewish laws, but also observe other laws as well. But the division between those two it worked nicely, except, or it became more complicated in the modern world because one of the conditions for citizenship was embracing the notion that religious observance becomes something private and becomes something voluntary. So for the Jewish community, what had been mandatory for a good period of time became something voluntary. And so for the last 200 years in some places, a little bit less in Eastern Europe, a little bit less in the Muslim world, the challenge for Jewish communal leadership has been trying to figure out how to make sure Jews observe halacha and remain affiliated to the Jewish community, which once upon a time had been a given, how to make sure those things happen in an age of religious volunteerism. And there are different Jewish responses to this challenge. In fact, denominations with Judaism Orthodox, conservative, reform, we can distinguish between them. In one of the ways we can distinguish between them is in terms of how they address this challenge of religious leadership in the age of religious volunteerism. So, for Orthodox Judaism, a mentality which has existed for about 200 years, if we come back to the metaphor of the chessboard, what Orthodox Judaism basically did, and their motivation here is they were concerned that citizenship and religious volunteerism would lead to the demise of Judaism and religious observance among Jews. So their response was to say, nothing more can change. The mantra of the founder of Orthodox Judaism, an early 19th century Hungarian rabbi named Moses Sofer, his mantra was, Kol davar chadash, asur me'hatorah. Anything that is new, anything that is novel, innovative, is forbidden by the Torah. Now, the fact that that notion itself was new, the paradox on which Orthodox Judaism was founded, that's the subject of another talk. But so, for if you want to hear more, you can ask me about it. You can ask during Q&A if you want to hear more. But the point is, in terms of the chessboard, what Orthodox Judaism did 2 centuries ago was to place a glass dome over the board so the pieces could no longer move. Now, Reform Judaism, a very different response. The original goal of Reform Judaism, which began in Germany and spread elsewhere and then came to America, the basic notion was the only way for Judaism to remain relevant for Jews living in open societies as citizens with full rights and full access to mainstream society is that Judaism itself must be altered. And in terms of the chessboard, the notion was the only way to make sufficient changes, to make the right changes, is to violate the rules of the game. So Reform Judaism basically took those halachic principles, the rules by which one could interpret Jewish law, and set them aside. So for Reform Judaism, if you know your chess, rooks can move diagonally, among other things. But it was deemed as necessary to adapt Judaism to this new reality. So we have these two those two responses. Now the Orthodox response also included the following. There was a fear that in this age of religious volunteerism, observance would stop. So the Orthodox community, Orthodox Judaism, basically reinvented itself as a voluntary society in which, if you want to belong, you have to commit to the notion that observing Jewish law is still mandatory. Even if in the world it's no longer. Even if the structure, the infrastructure that once had made it mandatory was no longer there. Even though the bottom line is it was a choice to be part of the Orthodox community, you have to continue to act and to believe, or at least to pretend to believe, that all of these laws and customs and practices are mandatory. I'll give you a specific example. Today, especially in 20th and 21st century America, the shibboleth between the observant and the non-observant Jew, or put it another way, the shibboleth between the Orthodox and the non-Orthodox Jew really has come down to a single choice. Do you drive in a car on Shabbat, or do you not drive in a car on Shabbat? Now, that's a choice you get to make. If you drive in a car on Shabbat, no one is putting you in jail. I mean, it depends how you drive, I suppose. If you drive safely on Shabbat, you will be fine. The Jewish community doesn't have the authority to coerce you. But the Orthodox community, being this self-consciously defined voluntary society, can say, if you drive in a car on Shabbat, you are not part of this community. I'll give you a personal example. This wasn't in America. This was in Kiev. There's an Orthodox synagogue in Kiev, and I was traveling there with a group of Jewish teenagers. This is probably 20 years ago. And the synagogue there is an Orthodox synagogue, and it was clear we were not Orthodox Jews. The synagogue was too far from our hotel. I think we had taken cabs to get to the synagogue, and they would not give us a part in the synagogue. You know, the sort of the comic part is I had been there with a different group the year before. The rabbi had been out of town, and I guess they didn't know about that rule. They let me read the whole Torah reading. But the next year when the rabbi was there, he was very nice and very gracious, but we didn't get to do anything at all. So halacha in the world of orthodoxy, it really has been transformed into something which the Orthodox world has sort of synthesized or retained its pre-modern status by the consent of Orthodox Jews themselves. And I don't want you to get the impression that they're forced to do this. I don't think so. This is something that Orthodox Jews have. This is a choice they have made. They might have been compelled by one thing or another, family pressure, peer pressure, wanting to be part of this community. But this is the choice they've made, and this is the way they have embraced it. Now the complexity, the complications of adapting halacha, a halachic way of lifestyle, to the modern world, where it really gets interesting, where it really gets complicated, is not in the overall world of observance, because I would say 80 or 90% of what there is in terms of observing halacha is perfectly and easily adaptable to living in a modern state and society. For the simple reason that halacha as a Jewish way of life was invented by Jews in the diaspora. It was designed on the premise that Jews are a minority living in this larger non-Jewish majority. That's the way it was designed, and that part of it was easy. But there are certain aspects of Jewish law which have been a little bit trickier to adapt. And this goes back to another element of this pre-modern halachic world, that being that halacha was part of an all-encompassing Jewish identity. Jewish law, halacha, it regulated every aspect of Jewish life. Not just religious aspects, not just prayer and the synagogue and dietary laws, but everything, even things that we would now call part of civic life. Halacha, it regulated rules of inheritance. It regulated marriage and divorce and education and social life and leisure time and dress and language and food and culture and everything. But in the modern world, being Jewish in the modern world, Jewish identity has increasingly been transformed from something all-encompassing into something compartmentalized. So for the pre-modern Jew, the whole of his or her identity was, I am Jewish. If we went back 300 years in time and asked a Jew anywhere in the world to, who are you? The answer would simply be, I am Jewish. But if we ask Jews today that same question, who are you? I am Jewish is part of the answer. But the answer could also be, I am American. I am a Michigander or an Ohioan. Ohioan? I don't know. Usually I say this in Michigan, so I just say Michigander. I am a Democrat or, a Republican, God forbid. But just, okay. But the point is, the modern Jewish identity is a compartmentalized Jewish identity, and it's compartmentalized between those specifically religious aspects of Jewish life, like prayer and keeping kosher and holidays, versus aspects of Jewish life which are governed by civic law. Marriage and divorce is a great example. Once upon a time, for Jews to get married, all they needed was a Jewish marriage contract called a ketubah. But in 20th century America, 21st century America, getting a ketubah, a Jewish marriage contract, is not sufficient. You also need a civil marriage license. And so too with divorce. A religious document of divorce, a get, is not enough. You also need a civil divorce. That's an example of being part of two worlds. But it's also an example of where it gets more complicated. Where it gets complicated is a couple that's getting divorced. Here's the problem, or here's the asymmetry. In civil divorce, typically, husband and wife, they have equal say or they have equal voice in determining the outcome of a civil divorce. But according to halacha, there's an asymmetry when it comes to divorce because of as follows. Traditionally, the Jewish marriage contract was not an agreement between bride and groom, but rather between the groom and the bride's father or brother or whatever man had jurisdiction over this woman. And because the bride / the wife was not a player, was not involved in the marriage contract, according to Halacha, the wife was not allowed to initiate a divorce. Only the husband could initiate a divorce. That's an asymmetry. Now, to be fair, the Jewish community, they were sort of stuck with that rule, but they went to great lengths to try to minimize its effects. So, for example, in cases where the husband was recalcitrant, the Jewish community would go and try to coerce him in one way or the other to try to redress that imbalance. The point is that that imbalance remains, and where it gets most difficult, or the biggest problem of that asymmetry with regard to Jewish divorce is you could have a woman who is stuck, who wants to get out of a marriage but can't, and if the man will not divorce her, and if he manages not to die, she is stuck in that marriage. You know, the Hebrew term for it is agunah, which means the anchored woman. It doesn't matter. She can't get out. It's up to the husband. The most tragic situation is if the husband disappears and there's no evidence that he's dead. Well, she's really stuck because there's no one to give her a divorce. She can't initiate it. Now, again, to be fair, a clause was added to Jewish marriage contracts, a retroactive clause which the husband stipulates, if I'm missing for an entire year, regardless of whether I'm confirmed dead, you get a divorce. It's called the Lieberman Clause. It was a very nice thing to do. But in the last 50 years or so, there have been cases of recalcitrant husbands. In other words, husbands who refuse to give their wives a get. And the woman who will be able to get a civil divorce cannot remarry without a get, if you subscribe to that very basic Jewish law. For a woman to remarry without a get, in addition to a civil divorce, that constitutes adultery, which is a pretty serious thing. So at some point, really probably beginning about 40 or 50 years ago, women, Jewish women who were stuck in that situation, they begin to have recourse, to resort to going to secular courts, civil courts, to take on that asymmetry in Jewish law. And this is a situation where halacha as a system of law began to overlap or even clash a little bit with civil law. It began in New York State, not surprisingly, that's where most of the Jews are, so it's not surprising when it first came up. And so in 1980, the state of New York, its court system issued what came to be known as Domestic Relations Law 253, DRL 253, which had to do with removals of barriers to remarriage. Now, it's addressing the woman who is stuck because of a recalcitrant husband who won't give her a get. And it says as follows: any party to a marriage defined in subdivision of one of the sections, in other words, when we get to the good part, who commences a proceeding to annul the marriage or for a divorce must allege in his or her verified complaint that to the best of his or her knowledge that he or she has taken or that will take prior to the entry of final judgment all steps solely within his or her power, here's the important thing, to remove any barrier to the defendant's remarriage following the divorce. In other words, this is a state law which says that for a civil divorce to be legitimate, there can be no remaining barriers to remarriage. So it doesn't explicitly mention the problem of a woman who can't get a get from her husband, but implicitly it's there. This is a civil law which is not saying, it's not intruding into Jewish law. That would violate separation of religion and state. But it's saying that a law, that a civil divorce must not create the possibility, any possibility, for barriers to remarriage. Now, that was originally issued in 1980, and for the first 12 or 15 years it was on the books, but it wasn't very effective because there was no way to enforce it. It was a nice idea. But in the 1990s, in 1992, a codicil, an addition was added which said that in the enforcement of DRL 253, The judge, meaning the civil judge, has a right to use that factor, use a barrier to remarriage as a factor in distributing property in the divorce. So if you have a recalcitrant husband who won't give a get, who is leaving, who is the cause of a barrier to remarriage, the judge can say, well, unless you remove that barrier for your soon-to-be ex-wife, you're not getting any property out of this civil settlement. That is a way to create a better blend between the halachic notion of divorce, which has this asymmetry in it, and the civil notion of divorce, which is far more symmetric. So that is a way that has smoothed over that problem. Now, the other area where we see the separation of religion and state become somewhat problematic is in the area of education. Now, for a long time, for centuries, education for Jews meant Jewish education with a little bit of general education thrown in. Typically, Ashkenazic Jews had the least amount of general education. Every other Jewish community in the world had more. It's one of those ways which we as Ashkenazic Jews are always a little bit behind the time. But again, that's a different story. But the point is, the issue of different kinds of education wasn't really that much of an issue. But in the modern world, and particularly in 20th century America, with the emergence of public school, suddenly there were new requirements regarding education and what to do about that. Now, this wasn't just a halachic problem. This was a much deeper problem because education, of course, especially for a minority people living in a majority culture, facing the pressure of disappearing through assimilation, the education of the Jewish education of the next generation was very important. So for centuries, the goal of Jewish education had not only been to impart knowledge, it had been to create Jews who were literate, but also to instill a sense of Jewish values and a sense of commitment to the Jewish community and to the survival of the Jewish people. That became more difficult to do in the age of religious volunteerism and the age of public schooling. When, and this happened very quickly in 20th century America, when the overwhelming majority of American Jews began to opt for public school, this made it very difficult for the Jewish community to figure out how are we going to give these kids a Jewish education. And there was a lengthy, protracted experiment called Hebrew school. And now this is going to sound a little bit, I mean this with the greatest respect to all Hebrew school programs. Some of them were more successful than others, but overall, as an enterprise of Jewish education, well, assessments of it vary between limited success and disastrous failure. The problem is, after school for kids, very difficult. They're tired. Not to mention that school counted for something. You know, you go to school, you're trying to get into college. There were real ramifications. Hebrew school, if you goof off, if you skip, in the age of religious volunteerism, where's the consequence? So what to do beyond Hebrew school? Well, there was some notion that maybe, what if something Jewish or teaching Judaism became part of the public school curriculum? Now, this was an idea that was flirted with in Europe. There were non-Jewish schools in Germany in particular and elsewhere where they would have a class in religion and theology where the Catholic kids would go with theirs and the Protestants with their clergy, and the Jewish students would go study with the rabbi for a couple of hours a week. Okay, that was not possible here because teaching religion in public schools violates the notion of the separation of church and state. It wasn't possible. Now, there was a way around it, sort of, where with the advent in the 20th century of secular Jewish culture, you know, in movements like Zionism and Buddhism, which is Jewish socialism, suddenly the Hebrew language coming out of Zionism became a subject which was non-religious but secular. So the possibility of teaching Jewish children Hebrew as a language in public school became possible. When I was growing up in Southfield, I grew up in West Bloomfield, Michigan in Oak Park, but at Southfield Lathrop High School, Hebrew was taught as a curricular subject. And the reason it was allowed, it was because it was Hebrew language and maybe literature. There was nothing religious about it, but that was very dicey because as soon as you approached the problem of religious instruction, it became a problem and didn't really work. Now, the antidote to the solution of Jewish education, the way to do it really was the day school movement. The day school movement, where you would have half a day Jewish studies and half a day general studies, skirted the problem of the separation of religion and state by basically creating Jewish parochial schools. So in the same way that in Catholic schools you can teach the Catholic catechism without violating the First Amendment, so too in a Jewish day school you can teach anything Jewish you want as long as you start from the premise this is not a public school. Then, of course, the problem is, and this is the problem that day schools have had, if you're not getting state funding, it becomes very expensive, and it becomes not entirely accessible, and they're still working on that problem. Now, the wrinkle here is that there are some Jewish communities, particularly, I would say, Orthodox, maybe ultra-Orthodox communities, who maybe are less concerned about the First Amendment, and what they have been lobbying for lately is, but they love the idea of a charter school. A charter school is a way to receive state funding for what is essentially a public school by calling it a different kind of school. So they've been trying to get public funding for schools that, are specifically Jewish schools. It's a complicated issue, but but I would say that is a minority phenomena. The mainstream Jewish attitude toward the separation of religious and state, and by mainstream, I'm going to guesstimate here that 80 to 90% of American Jews right now would agree with what I'm about to say. It might be a little high, but not very high. 80% would agree that religion and civic society should be separate. And whatever the challenges are with divorce, whatever the challenges are with education, it's best to deal with these things separate. And one of the reasons this is true is the way in which the First Amendment itself is put together, because the separation of religious and state, the Establishment Clause, goes hand in hand. It is inseparable for the right of religious freedom. And the notion is, the concern is, if you start to muck up with that separation, it could reverberate and muck up with the rights of Jews to be Jewish. And so we have a situation where, in one way or another, Jews in America have figured out how to compartmentalize, how to segment, separate their halachic lives and their American civic lives. It's not a perfect resolution. There are still problems. One of the biggest problems is this Jewish way of life, is it able to withstand the pressures and temptations of living in an open society? That's still an open question. However, I will say this, and I'll end with this little bit of information. There was a survey conducted of American Jewish Society, the Pew Survey, about 10 years ago, and it came up with these bleak results for the identity of American Jews. Outside the non-Orthodox community in America, most American Jews have an anemic Jewish identity at best. Most don't do very much in terms of religion. Most aren't very well educated. A very, very bleak picture, which suggests that the strategies until now in transferring and passing along Jewish identity haven't worked very well. Except there was one question in the Pew survey which it came up with a different result. After all of these Jews taking this survey, non-Orthodox Jews saying, I don't do very much as Jewish, in response to the question, are you proud to be Jewish? 94% of American Jews said yes. So whatever's working, what's not working, there still is an ethos. The other thing I would mention is that there are always alarm bells sounding in the American Jewish community. How will we withstand the open society? American Jews are going to disappear. They're not going to survive. The truth of the matter is, every generation of American Jews in America for the last couple of centuries was convinced it was the last generation of Jews in America. It was difficult to see how the future would fit. Every generation, thankfully, has been wrong. every generation has managed to figure out how to bridge or how to connect, how to integrate a life with one foot in the world of Halacha and the Jewish community and one foot in American society. Thank you. And now, my friend and colleague, Saeed Khan.
All right, thank you. You want your water, Howie? Oh, there's water. We've done this once or twice, so I watch out. I don't mind being Howie's water bearer, is it? All right. Good afternoon. Shalom Aleichem. Salam Alaikum. Thank you so much for having both of us, certainly having me here. Thank you to Lourdes University. Interesting, a little connection that I have to Lourdes is I know it's also the name of Madonna's daughter. And Madonna's from my hometown of Rochester Hills, Michigan. In fact, she went to Rochester Adams High School, which is the closest high school to my home. So I guess there's always 1 degree of separation to anything. And thank you to the Goldberg Foundation and family for sponsoring this very important lecture series to which we are so honored to be a part of. In Islam, there is a prophetic tradition that there are 3 ways that a person can gain spiritual reward even after they have, as Shakespeare would say, departed this mortal coil, that it is the prayers and the blessings of their children. It is if they establish an institution which then benefits society, and if they impart knowledge which then continues in perpetuity. And I think that this lecture series, in fact, does all 3. And so hopefully that means that Rabbi Goldberg will be benefiting from this lecture series as we are certainly benefiting from that. So thank you so much. I'm always tickled when I hear Howie mention something, a new nugget of information, because I see how can I then go ahead and process it through my vast knowledge of pop culture. And you mentioned Rabbi Sofer. Talking about keeping innovation out. And I'm like, wow, I'm having a deja vu moment to so many a dinner party in a Muslim household about how do we keep innovations out and what is wrong with new. And new in many ways is such a relative term, and I'll show you how. There is, among the several dozen colleges at the University of Oxford in England, a college known as New College Oxford. Founded in 1369. But it's relative because Oxford was founded in 1096. So I suppose close to 3 centuries later, it was considered to be somewhat new. And in many ways, the track of Islam and the track of Judaism, of course, Islam not nearly being as old as Judaism is, provide a kind of scope and scale and contextuality that we here in the United States really cannot fully fathom. We are a country that is so very young. It's one of the reasons that, and this might even be apocryphal at this point, but it makes a great anecdote, that there was a diplomatic meeting in Europe, and the American representative was going on and on about America. And finally, the European diplomat said, "Sir, you need to remember that your history is still younger than our geography, and so keep that in mind." And when we're then trying to understand this relatively new experience of Muslims living in a form of a diaspora, trying to then examine what has been the trail that has been blazed, particularly here in the United States for it. Certainly the Jewish community is one to which it looks quite deeply. And I'm so glad that we have my former instructor here, Dr. Weinberg, because, and I don't know if you remember this, but one time I approached him about a book that really changed my perspective on understanding Islam in America, and that book is called American Judaism, A History by Jonathan Sarna. And I really wanted to discuss the book with him, and his first question is like, why are you reading American Judaism? And I, of course, had to say, because Canadian Judaism just didn't do it for me. So what I found in reading it, though, was quite remarkable, because I could see a trajectory. I could see the historical arc in which American Jews had then tried to navigate and negotiate a life in the diaspora in all ways, cultural, social, legal, etc. And then finding how Muslims, as they were beginning their similar course here in the United States, were following a path that had now formed a nice groove within it. Now, obviously, there's distinctions. Obviously, there are, for example, different historical realities that brought the Jewish community here, and the similar analysis of push and pull factors will show variation when it comes to the American Muslim community. But at its very heart is understanding then that as minority communities, how do they then, as the title is so aptly placed, straddle a world in which they have their own identity and that which belongs to the broader. Similar to how we described Halacha, Sharia is also one of these terms that has borne quite a lot of contestation, particularly in the public discourse over the last, well, certainly last 2 decades, but even longer. And I remember in the year right after 9/11, there was a term that somehow or the other was discovered by some kind of archaeological fiat, and this term was jihad, and it became sort of the new buzzword that everyone wanted to understand, what does jihad really mean? And then finally, when that kind of subsided, the next word was Sharia, and then after that was taqiyya, and there's a lot of these, and this is not a lesson in Arabic, but certainly it was interesting that just like you have one of those calendars that you rip the new day and has a new word on it, there seemed to be this insatiable curiosity about terminology. And I concede that, of course, there is a certain exoticism, there's a certain level of foreignness to these words. But if one were to actually peel the onion back a few layers and understand how law, both in Judaism and Islam, has evolved these several centuries, one will see a sophistication and a methodology which certainly, if not is at par with, but in many ways exceeds that which we see in American and other Western legal traditions. There's no way that a people can survive for thousands of years without having an underlying legal system that provides functionality, which provides justice, which provides fairness for their respective communities. Because at the very end of the day, law has to be something which provides structure and functionality for these various communities. And so the word Sharia, actually, like with Jewish law and halacha, doesn't mean law. There are other words for law in Islam. You ready for this one, Howie? Deen, haq, qanun. Yeah, I'm not plagiarizing. I mean, this is haq. This is truth. Sharia actually means literally the path toward water. The idea that there is both a metaphoric and a literal component to this, that one is traveling toward water because of what water gives you and how water sustains you. And that, I think, is a very apt way of how one can then interact and engage with what we consider law. Like halacha, Sharia in its totality is a way of life. It is supposed to then regulate all aspects of life. And remember, Sharia is a law, or law in its most abstract consideration, is something that regulates society. There's also ethics which will regulate the individual. And for communities that live in societies that are not governed totalistically, it's important to then recognize that how law and ethics are not exactly synonymous terms. And I'll go ahead and I'll describe this. Within Sharia, there are 3 kinds of contracts or relationships that the individual has, and in which Sharia has a form of governance. One is, of course, the individual's relationship with God. And the Sharia then is something that presents itself mostly through rituals. in the liturgical aspect, how one prays, how often one prays, how one fasts, when somebody fasts, etc. The 5 pillars, if you will. There is also another element of Sharia which perhaps is going to be the most familiar to all of us, and that is the relationship of the individual to the community. Now, that community doesn't have to necessarily be one's own religious community, but the community writ large, and it can also mean one's family. And then lastly, there's an element of Sharia which governs the individual to oneself. And this, of course, similar to in Halacha, would involve dietary regulations, it would involve hygiene and sanitation, and it would also involve modesty. Now, when we think of a legal system like that of the United States, and certainly in what would be considered to be modern Western law, it's very difficult to necessarily then talk about regulation of food or dietary aspects outside that which the Department of Agriculture will then go ahead and set when it comes to, for example, why employees at Burger King shouldn't be bathing in the sink. Yes, that was on the internet, so it must be true. And other such stunts on TikTok. Thankfully, there is such regulation abound. So when we take a look then at how a Muslim engages with Sharia, or as sometimes it's called Sharia law, which would just essentially be law, we have to then understand that how the Muslim then sees Sharia through the lens of his or her reality is going to be different than how somebody else perceives Sharia to be. And oftentimes the disjuncture comes where both people are actually right. When a Muslim talks about the Sharia that governs his or her own life, particularly living as a minority community in the United States, it is not aspirational, it is not about an idyllic situation, it is about what is the reality in front of him or herself. And that generally concerns how one then treats oneself according to the legal obligations by how one should, and how one has a relationship with God. When it comes to the community, there is, of course, an ethical imperative because there's a legal system that exists above and beyond it that is not necessarily incompatible with his or her understanding of the Sharia. So when we talk about the foot being, one foot being in one place and one foot being in the other, there's another important concept that has to go along with that, and that is a concept of balance. It's easy to go ahead and say that one has one foot in a shallow end of one area and in a deep end of the other area, and that necessarily is going to be something that causes imbalance or could lead to vertigo. Here, though, we're talking about an adherence to Sharia and an adherence to broader American law, which provide a sense of symmetry and a sense of balance. So let's go and take a look at some of the basic elements of Sharia and how one comes through this methodological approach. Of course, paramount within Islam is the Quran, which Muslims believe to be the inerrant and literal word of God, something that according to Islamic tradition was transmitted to the Prophet Muhammad by Archangel Gabriel over a 22-year span from the year 610 in the Common Era until and ending with the Prophet's death in the year 622 of the Common Era. Now, a lot of people will consider the Quran to be this corpus of laws. And in fact, scholars will contend that barely 40% of the Quran can even be considered to be a legal document. There is a plethora of other stories, lessons, allegories that one can draw from this. But if we were to say what is actually legal, or to put it another way, what would be on a law school exam, it's really only about 40%. So we're talking about, out of 6,000 or so verses, maybe about 2,400 at the most. And within that, it is also important to recognize that the Quran speaks to two different audiences. One is, Ya ayyuhal lazina amanu, O you who believe. And the other audience is Ya ayyuhan nas, O you mankind. So the Quran does not make a distinction between necessarily the believer and the non-believer, but understanding the connection that people have on humanity. And if one thinks about it then, the Quran is actually equipped for understanding this architecture of having a foot in two different arenas. On top of the Quran, there is, of course, the prophetic tradition, the Sunnah, which is codified in the Hadith, a collection or a compilation of the Prophet Muhammad's teachings, sayings, as well as first-hand eyewitness account of how he managed a situation, including those which would be considered arbitrating a legal dispute. These verses are revealed to the Prophet in two different eras, if you will. In the time that the Muslims were in Mecca, from 610 until 622, we find that the verses of the Quran tend to focus on spiritual dimensions, distinguishing the monotheism of Islam with the polytheism, which was the dominant religion of Arabia at the time, making a further distinction away from what was known as henotheism, the dominance of paganism, but also the allowance or the accommodation for other faiths like monotheism. The verses have a wonderful literary dimension to them, using stories of the Bible, the Old and the New Testament, to serve as allegory, which of course presumes that the target audience that was predominantly polytheistic at this time in Arabia had a working knowledge of the stories of the Bible. And that, of course, was due to trade. People became familiar with the stories because once upon a time before social media, people actually talked to one another and they shared stories. And the stories of religion, of course, really lend themselves to a wonderful narrative. I mean, I used to be the biggest fan of Greek mythology. I mean, the stories of Poseidon, the stories of Zeus, particularly because if you were a preteen or a teenager, that was the easiest way for you to hear salacious stuff without being in trouble of listening to something R-rated. Wonderful how you could get under the radar when you heard about who Zeus hooked up with. What also has to be understood is that the Arabian Peninsula had Christians and Jews living within the societies as well. Now, in the Medinan period, from 622 to 632, when the Prophet and the small group of Muslims who were following him had to flee Mecca because of the persecution that they were facing, now things change. For those of you who are Bob Dylan fans, this is when Islam goes electric. Okay, one person, the Newport Festival, all right. I must be getting old. When Medina develops, it is the first Muslim state. And we find that the verses then adapt to this new reality by focusing on social engineering. And so now we find laws starting to develop, especially in matters of contract. For those of you who are lawyers out there, the doctrine of unconscionability will be something that one will find in the Quran well before Williston's Meditations on Contracts years and centuries later. One person laughs, so we know who's the lawyer. So we also find issues of marriage, divorce, others that would then be needed for a functional society. But there's more to it than just what the Quran provides. There is also templates. When the Prophet enters Medina, one of the first challenges that he finds is not theology, but demographics. He is bringing a small group of completely dispossessed and displaced individuals who have followed him through the desert by faith alone. Faith both in God and faith in his commitment to seeing things through. They enter a city that has several pagan tribes as well as a series of Jewish tribes who live within the precincts of Medina. The Prophet coming into Medina is conferred with the leadership of Medina by a grateful group of tribes because he had settled a dispute that had been causing political paralysis for the community. Well, when he comes in, he's having to then recognize that he does not want to appear to his own Muslim followers as though he'll be too obsequious and deferential to the locals. And at the same time, he doesn't want to relegate the Muslims into a permanent or an indefinite status of being second-class individuals there. So how do you then obtain a balance? Well, the Prophet comes through with what's known as the Constitution of Medina, where you're moving from a society of 2 demographic groups to 3 demographic groups. And in the process, he very elegantly not only re-socially or re-engineers the society of Medina, but he does so in a way where it retains everybody's rights, everybody's theological space, and creates something new for the peninsula: citizenship. Prior to this, people's citizenship, if you want to call it that, was really not citizenship at all. You belonged to your own tribe, and that tribe was a function of your genealogy or your blood. Now, the prophet is saying you are going to be a citizen to a city-state. You will all pledge allegiance to the city-state and create a new social contract with one another. So if you are a Jew from Medina, if you're a pagan from Medina, or if you are a Muslim from Medina, you are all Medinan. Kind of like Ohioan, I guess, Howie. And this was revolutionary, because in what Muhammad was doing is he was moving a society which was based on tangibility. Tangibility of theology with idols, tangibility of citizenship belonging to a tribe, to now having a theology and a sociology which were transcendent. And there was a gradual movement toward the transcendental God over a period of 10 years, and there was this movement sociologically toward transcendental forms of citizenship. Well, that also then provides us with an understanding, and this is perhaps something unique for even maybe Muslim ears to hear, that there was a component of secularity within Medina of the Prophet. The idea that people were allowed to maintain their own religious traditions, they were allowed to maintain their own religious laws, demonstrates then that when we consider secularity to be, and I'll use the word again, new, modern secularity has a completely different history, and we'll talk about that in a second. To demonstrate this notion of religious chauvinism not being embedded within Islam per se, the Prophet also embarks on creating a series of agreements with the various tribes throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And as Medina starts to ascend within its own potency and authority throughout the region, he makes sure that these agreements are not ones that are impositions or coercions. So with some tribes, we find that they will recognize both the religious as well as the socioeconomic political authority of Medina. Other tribes, there is no compulsion for them to do so. They may recognize the political authority of Medina, but not the religious authority of Medina. And what we find is that the farther out you go, there are situations where people don't have to recognize either authority as long as they agree not to war against Medina. That is another form of secularity which I think is very important to then understand as far as how solutions can be made in order to navigate different kinds of space. Now, as Islam, of course, spreads, it moves from being a state to becoming an empire. But as it spreads through these various regions in a very quick amount of time, we also find that the leadership of the Muslim state starts to allow for the appropriation of existing legal systems that are already in the provinces. For example, when Islam reaches Syria, Syria at one time had been part of the Byzantine Empire. And we find that the Caliph, the second successor to Muhammad, who ruled from 634 to 644, Omar decides to then codify the Byzantine tax code. The revenue collection methods were then brought into and under the fold of Islam, under the auspices that it is neither un- or anti-Islamic, and of course the other more famous Islamic adage, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And this becomes very important to then understand that the proprietary stamp of Islam on a particular legal system was not mandatory. It was also understood that people are creatures of habit, and if a legal system is in a place, if maintaining that will then lead to a minimization of discord, so be it. And this also, of course, existed when it came to religious minorities and their retention of not only their own legal systems, but also the agency to then determine and evolve their own legal systems. Now, people ask the question about Sharia, and is Sharia coming to America? as though it's the Beatles in '64. I hate to tell you this, folks, but Sharia is already here. And it's baked into the American legal system. And in fact, one would argue that the American legal system is already 98% Sharia compliant. It is one of the reasons why Muslims feel so completely adapted within the American system. If you want to talk about Sharia, though, we have to then understand what are the other components to make it work. What are the mechanisms? Well, first of all, you need a state. One cannot have some anarchistic system in order for Sharia to exist. If you take a look at then what are the American models of law, we have, of course, and this will take you back to either a civics class or Schoolhouse Rock, we have the executive branch, which enforces law. We have the legislative branch, which makes the law. And we have the judicial branch, which interprets the law. I guess these days in theory. What's that song by the Beach Boys? Wouldn't it be nice? Yeah, there you go. Those are mandatory, whether it is in the American legal system or within an Islamic legal system. Without having an executive, a caliph, to go ahead and enforce the law, the Islamic legal system collapses as a full authority system that has to then be applied to everybody involved. Similarly, there needs to be a judicial system, a group of the ulama, the scholars who will interpret the law, and there also needs to be then those who can legislate and adapt law or create law from the basic sources or the primary sources to deal with new situations coming in life. You hear a term like the caliph, and of course ISIS really did a number on disparaging this. And there has not been a caliphate in Islam since 1924 when it was abolished by the Turkish parliament in Ankara in that year. Well, the caliph is not necessarily a religious figure. The caliph is simply the head of the executive branch who will then go ahead and enforce the law. Now, the caliph is such an important title that the Ottoman Empire made sure that in 1517, when they conquered Egypt, they brought the caliphate back as an office to Istanbul. The caliphate had been in Egypt since the year 1258 when the Mongols had sacked Baghdad, the Muslim capital, and essentially moved it over like moving the flag over from one battleship to another. Because they recognized that along with, of course, the prestige and the honor of being the caliphate, it was really a solemn duty to be the titular head of the entire Muslim world. Now, it was the Ottoman Empire that also implemented another very important legal construct, and that was known as the millet system, because the Ottoman Empire was tremendously diverse, going into 3 different continents and having pretty much every imaginable religion within the Mediterranean basin. There was another pragmatic approach. If people who are members of religious ethnic minorities have agency over their own religious systems, they feel enfranchised, and particularly as the advent of new forms of nationalism start to grow, this will probably be a disincentive for them to head for the exits. So the millet system then gave the authority to each religious community, both interfaith and intrafaith, to designate their own respective religious leaders and have full control over all matters religious. Because there was no need for the caliph to determine when do the high holidays start, when is Easter. We're talking about, of course, a faith community that can't really decide when Eid is. It could be on one of 3 different days. So it might just be a favor to Jews and Christians that you get to pick when your own observances and holidays and festivals are. You're quite welcome. There's also the issue of personal law, marriage, divorce, custody, inheritance, succession. It would be a far reach for the caliph to get into the deep reeds of Halacha or Christian law and make those determinations. One thing that the caliph didn't want to do was be accused of Christian-splaining or Jew-splaining. So having these vested in each community, deciding who is the chief rabbi of Salonika, deciding who's the patriarch of Alexandria, even deciding who's the marja in the Shia community, because the Ottoman Empire was predominantly Sunni. This was all done through the millet system. Now, that means that in a sense, you don't exactly have a full secular system, but you also do not have the imposition of Islam upon everybody. Now, if there was a dispute between two members of different religions, or if there was a matter of what we would sometimes consider secular law, like commercial law, civil law, those would be handled by Ottoman law, to be sure. But that still gives a tremendous deference to each religious community and the kind of law that they can then practice on matters that are intimate and important to them. So when and how did the rupture happen where Sharia then had some of the wheels fall off the wagon or at least get wobbly? Well, colonialism really does a number. And we find that over the last 200 years, with the advent of European incursion into the so-called Muslim world, either directly through occupation or indirectly through economic and military nudging, shall we say, the Ottoman Empire and other Muslim polities then are really thrown into a maelstrom of trying to understand how modernity, which is of course being brought sometimes by coercion by Western powers to the Muslim world, how can Sharia then adapt to it? Well, if it was left to its own devices to then have an organic growth, to then address and tackle those issues of modernity that were being visited and upon it, one can probably surmise and infer that there would have been certainly a little bit of clumsiness because they would have had a learning curve, then trying to understand how does industrialization with its many consequences affect the Muslim world, and the social transformations that were now underway in Europe because of industrialization, how would those affect family dynamics, how would they affect the social ecosystem in Muslim countries. But that didn't really happen. In fact, if anything, what ends up happening is two different trajectories. Either the suppression of Sharia in favor of other more quote-unquote magnanimous legal systems like in British India, or in the case of the Ottoman Empire, the feeling that they needed to adopt legal systems from Europe. The Swiss legal code, the Italian legal code, the French legal code. Well, here's the problem. You cannot just pick up an entire legal system and put it in your own society, like an engine block from one car to another. You have to recognize that that legal system that comes from Switzerland or from France or Italy has its own history. It has its own cultural and political trajectory that has brought it to that point. It is a living, breathing thing, like Howie said about the Halacha. It is dynamic. But it is somebody else's dynamism which brought it to that point. And perhaps most egregiously when it comes to the new modern definition of secular, when it comes to the separation of church or religious authority from state authority, well, that has a history too. In the same year that the Ottoman Empire conquers Egypt, 1517, there was this monk who had 95 grievances in a pre-Festivus world who decides that he's going to go ahead and nail those complaints on the door church in Wittenberg. This, of course, is Martin Luther, and he then spawns a Reformation, which then leads into a rather malevolent 30-year war, which then leads to the Peace of Westphalia, which creates the notion of the modern nation state, and from there we really have this divergence between religious and state authority. Now, when we ask Muslims to then designate who is their Martin Luther, who is their reformer, and how is Islam going to finally get it by separating mosque and state, that's a history that Islam never really had. And I'm always tickled when people ask the question about Martin Luther, or the Muslim Martin Luther. And somebody actually asked me if I was this person, and I said maybe Erasmus, but not Martin Luther. Okay, now we know who the Christians are in the room. I remember a really dear friend of mine who's a pastor of a Church of Christ church in Michigan invited me to give a talk on this. And the first question that I asked the audience is, I said, okay, what denomination is this? And they said, why do you care? I said, well, if this is a Catholic church, then I suppose your view on Luther is going to be a little bit different than if this was a Protestant church. And they're like, oh, wow, never even thought about it. I'm like, gotcha. So imagine then how much more complicated it is to go ahead and ask a Muslim about whether he, in fact, or she, is really following in the footsteps of Martin Luther, or if, in fact, we really need that to happen here. Well, when we are taking a look then at the United States, and as I mentioned before, the incredible level of compatibility of Sharia and the American legal system, what then are we really talking about when we use the word compatibility? Let's see how much time, okay. We're really talking about the culture of religion. Paul Tillich, the religion scholar, said that culture was the vessel in which religion resides. And I thought that's such a beautiful metaphor, because in many ways, religion doesn't exist in a vacuum. The question then becomes, what state of matter is your religion? And I always ask this question in my religion, or not my religion classes, but in my courses on Near East and Asian Studies, especially when we discuss the advent of Islam. And I said, which state of matter is Islam? And one person confused me and they said it's plasma. And I said, dude, when I was in school, we only had 3 states of matter. So I said, is it a solid, is it a liquid, or is it a gas? And of course, this is how you then designate, because in Islam we do not have Orthodox, conservative, and reform, at least formally. This is the litmus test. The more conservatives say it's a solid. I mean, it is just structured, it's a pillar. And then, of course, you've got the people who are a little bit more, shall we say, the Woodstock Muslims, who would say that Islam is more of a gas. It's sort of ethereal, it's more Sufic, if you will. And I said, yeah, actually Islam is a liquid. It will take on the shape of the container in which it finds itself. Now, the substance itself will not change. I mean, Coca-Cola well, okay, that's a bad example. Coke in a glass bottle definitely tastes different than Coke in a plastic bottle. Coffee will taste, I'm hoping I'm not going to offend anyone, the same if it's in a Starbucks cup as it will in some other kind of cup. The only thing that, of course, changes is the perception because of the vessel in which it finds itself. And I said, this is very apt to then understand what is the future of Islam in the United States. Part of it is trying to gain an understanding of how religion has negotiated itself in the United States, particularly those that do not belong to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority. As we've heard here very eloquently, Judaism certainly has had a trajectory, and of course it has challenges on how now to adapt. And in many ways, I found that as I moved here at the age of 8 from England, yes, I've grown up my entire life culturally Christian. It's impossible not to if one is educated in the public school system of England, which they call state schools over there, which are, of course, governed by the Church of England, which means that you have an assembly every morning, which means that you sing hymns, and then we used to end, because this is how old I am, singing a devotional song, which was #1 on the charts at that time, called Morning Has Broken by Cat Stevens, who now is Muslim, because that's the way the world works. And I came to the United States and I found how, and this is of course because when you're 8 years old and British, you definitely see yourself as elitist, how completely unoriginal the cafeteria menus were on Fridays. Every single Friday, you could set your watch to it, was fish sandwiches and macaroni and cheese. And then I finally investigated, Catholics, meatless Friday. And so this, at a very early age, meant that there was a certain accommodation which was occurring, depending on the critical mass and the need of kids not starving to death every Friday or having an inadvertent and involuntary fast. And in many ways, that kind of education of what America really is in its relationship to religion provides a kind of clarity away from the mythology of what then creates these misconceptions. Is America a Christian nation? Is America a completely secular nation where there is a wall between church and state? Well, what's interesting is that problem was resolved not by Thomas Jefferson and his letter to the Danbury Baptist Association in 1803, but actually 7 years before that by John Adams with the Barbary Treaties, or the Treaty of Tripoli in 1796, when Article 11 says that, do I have it? As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims, and as the said states never entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mohammedan nation, it is declared that by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries. That wasn't in the Afghan peace deal of yesterday, by the way. That's Article 11 from the Treaty of Tripoli. But it's interesting to see that a treaty which was then ratified unanimously by the United States Senate, which actually was then law, not a letter that the president sent to a church group 7 years later, was actually binding, then sets the pace for how America saw itself at the very inception. After all, just 9 years before that, the first country to recognize a nascent America was in fact Morocco, a Muslim country. So American identity as to how it sees itself is perhaps the biggest challenge for Muslims in America to then decide where they see themselves when it comes to how Sharia is going to be interpreted and implied by their own community, and how well received it will be by America as a whole. Now, we find in closing that the challenges that Islam faces today, notwithstanding Islamophobia, are going down to some very elemental levels. The Murfreesboro, Tennessee case, where a community was trying to seek the permit to build a mosque, was something that occurs, unfortunately, more often than not throughout the United States. But what made this particularly egregious was that the group of plaintiffs who then were challenging the Muslim community's decision and right to build a mosque went to the point of arguing that Islam is not a religion. Why? To then divorce it from First Amendment protection. It took the Department of Justice and then Attorney General Eric Holder to intervene and say, with 1.8 billion Muslims around the world existing for 1,400 years, I think it's pretty safe to give judicial notice that Islam is a religion. But people deciding that they were actually going to go there. Another challenge is being on the receiving end of discrimination under the guise of religious freedom. And I see this as being an issue that faces pretty much every religion, because someone or the other could then invoke their own free exercise of religion to deny service or to discriminate based on religious difference. But arguably, the biggest challenge facing Muslims today in America doesn't come from Sharia. It comes from corporate law. The corporatization of Islam in America is one that then creates the most fissures and the most challenges for a community that is still trying to build and establish its institutions. Before a single brick can be laid for a mosque, the very first thing that a Muslim community has to do is go down to the state capitol, file their articles of incorporation, file a set of bylaws, list who's the registered agent, go and open up a bank account, get the all-hallowed 501c3 tax-exempt status, get funders from the community who can then write it off, and before you know it, before you've even determined what is the direction of prayer toward Mecca, you now have an entire corporate board, and even more dangerously, the lens through which the community is going to see the world is through a corporate lens. That is something that Islam did not have when it emerges in the Arabian desert 1,400 years ago. The challenge for the Muslim American community, and particularly to understand how Sharia is going to play its way forward, is not taking a look at whether it has one foot in mainstream American society or one foot within its own Muslim identity, but how it's going to play with Amazon. Thank you.